CEO's daughter stopped the black janitor. "They attacked my mom. She's dying." Her secret shocked everyone. In downtown Chicago, where the skyline gleamed like silver daggers cutting through the clouds, a man named David Carter moved quietly through the world. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed. Every night, while the city drowned in noise, David showed up at the Lexan Corporate Plaza, a glass fortress of power where millionaire executives sealed billion-dollar deals and never once wondered who cleaned their offices after dark. He wore the same gray uniform every night, name tag slightly faded, shoes scuffed from years of labor. The staff called him the night guy. Some greeted him politely. Most didn't. He never complained, never spoke much, just worked, steady, precise, invisible. What no one knew was that David Carter hadn't always been a janitor. 5 years earlier, he had been Captain David Carter, a decorated soldier in the U.S. Army Special Forces. He'd led rescue missions in places most people couldn't find on a map. He'd seen chaos, death, and heroism. But after his final tour, something in him broke. Not physically, but silently, deep inside. He left it all behind. The medals, the noise, the recognition. All he wanted now was peace. Lexan Plaza gave him that. The quiet hum of lights, the faint smell of lemon polish, the rhythm of cleaning. It was predictable, calm. It was anonymity, and David preferred it that way. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Every night at 10 p.m., he started on the top floor, the executive suite, where polished oak desks and gold-trimmed nameplates reminded him how far power could reach. That floor belonged to Clara Whitfield, the CEO of Lexan Industries. She was known for her sharp intelligence and relentless drive. Her photo often appeared in business magazines, Chicago's youngest tech visionary. But to David, she was just another person whose office needed to be cleaned. Still, he had noticed small things about her. The half-drunk cups of coffee, the stack of files never touched, the framed photo of her little girl. Lily Whitfield, 7 years old, with golden curls and a smile too bright for boardrooms. Sometimes, when Clara worked late, Lily would wander the hallways, clutching a small teddy bear. She would wave shyly at David as he mopped the marble floor, and he'd wave back, the faintest smile tugging at his face. It was a strange kind of comfort, the only warmth in the cold steel heart of that building. But beneath the calm, something darker had been brewing. Clara had made enemies, powerful ones. Rumors whispered through the lower staff floors about a recent business deal gone wrong. She had reportedly turned down a massive buyout from Kane Global Holdings, a corporate giant run by billionaire Gregory Kane, a man known for his wealth and feared for his ruthlessness. "Nobody says no to Kane," one employee muttered one night as David passed by. "He'll crush her for it." David didn't think much of it then. Power games among the rich weren't his concern. He just kept his head down and cleaned. But sometimes, while emptying the CEO's trash, he'd notice crumpled letters, documents with red marks, and once, a threatening note scribbled across a torn page. "You'll regret this." Still, David dismissed it. In his mind, it wasn't his world to interfere with. That night, however, was different. A storm had rolled in from Lake Michigan, rattling the tall windows of the Lexan building. Rain streaked down the glass like cold tears. The city outside glowed with lightning, and inside, the halls were quieter than usual. Most employees had gone home hours ago. Only a few lights remained, one in the CEO's corner office. David continued his routine, pushing the mop across the glimmering floor. He paused occasionally to glance at the lightning flickering across the skyline. Then, from somewhere down the corridor, he heard a faint sound, the echo of footsteps far too light to belong to an adult. He turned. There, standing at the edge of the hall, was Lily. Her eyes were red, her little hands trembling as she clutched her teddy bear. For a second, David's heart sank. Something wasn't right. She shouldn't have been there. Not at that hour. He knelt slightly and asked softly, "Lily? What's wrong?" Her lip quivered. She took a shaky breath. "They're hurting my mom." Those words hit like a gunshot. David froze, the mop slipping from his hand. The hall suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. "They're hurting my mom." The phrase echoed in his head like an alarm. Without hesitation, he sprinted down the corridor toward Clara's office. The door was half open, light spilling out onto the marble floor. What he saw inside would change everything, and awaken a part of him he thought was gone forever. 3 men, black suits, masks, one holding Clara by the neck, another rifling through her drawers, the third watching the hallway. For a brief second, the old instincts kicked in. The silence of the janitor vanished. The soldier returned. David Carter, the invisible man of Lexington Plaza, was about to become the center of a storm that would shake Chicago's corporate elite, expose corruption at the highest level, and challenge every assumption about who deserves respect. Because that night, in the heart of power and prejudice, a man they called just the janitor would prove that some uniforms hide far greater strength than any title ever could. And by dawn, the world would know his name. The next few moments unfolded like a blur. In the CEO's office, the calm silence of the corporate night shattered into chaos. David didn't think, he moved. Years of combat training surged back like muscle memory buried under layers of quiet labor. The man watching the hallway lunged first, but David intercepted him mid-step, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest. Another swung a gun toward him, but David disarmed him with a swift twist, the weapon clattering across the floor. Within 10 seconds, 3 armed men lay on the ground, one unconscious, one groaning, and one gasping for air. Clara collapsed to her knees, struggling to breathe, her voice trembling. The room smelled of chemicals and spilled perfume. David noticed the needle on the floor, the faint shimmer of a syringe. Someone had tried to drug her. He leaned in to steady her, but before she could speak, the flashing red and blue of police lights flooded the glass walls. When the officers stormed in, guns drawn, Clara tried to call out his name, but her voice broke. They saw a black man hovering over a white woman and 3 downed assailants. Within seconds, they had him face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind his back. David didn't resist. He'd been in this position before, in war zones, not boardrooms, but the look on their faces was different this time. Not suspicion, assumption. He tried to explain, but one officer cut him off. "Save it. We'll sort it out downtown." As they dragged him through the lobby, the building security staff, people he'd nodded to for years, stood frozen. None stepped forward. To them, the janitor had crossed an invisible line. At the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. David sat across from 2 detectives who looked more tired than curious. They fired questions like bullets: who he was, why he was there, what he'd done to the CEO. He answered calmly, precisely, just as he had in military debriefs. He told them about the black van parked outside the building minutes before the attack. He told them the men were professionals, not thieves. But they didn't believe him. One detective leaned forward. "You expect us to believe a janitor took down 3 trained men by himself?" David looked up, his tone steady. "If I were with them, Clara Whitfield would be dead." Silence filled the room. The detectives exchanged a glance but said nothing. Hours later, the door opened. A woman in a tailored gray suit entered, her confidence cutting through the stale air. Evelyn Ross, corporate attorney. She slid a file onto the table. "This questioning is over," she said firmly. The officers hesitated. "You might want to read this," she added. On the cover of the file were the words, "Carter David J. Captain, U.S. Army Special Forces, Silver Star, 3 tours, Afghanistan." The detectives froze. Evelyn turned to David. "You're coming with me." Outside the station, she handed him another folder. Inside were documents, names, and surveillance photos. "You didn't just stumble into this," she said. Those men weren't common criminals. They work for Gregory Kane. That name again. The billionaire Clara had refused to sell to. Evelyn explained that Kane had a history. CEOs who turned down his offers later suffered mysterious accidents. Car crash here, a fire there. Always ruled as a coincidence. Always just far enough from suspicion. As Evelyn spoke, David realized this wasn't just about corporate greed, it was about control. Kane's empire thrived on intimidation, and Clara had become his next target. Meanwhile, news of the janitor attack at Lexington Plaza spread across local media. The footage, grainy security clips of David being led away in cuffs, fueled speculation. Commentators questioned how a janitor could overpower armed men. Some praised him. Others painted him as a suspect. And beneath the headlines, the same toxic whispers surfaced online. Black man attacks CEO. Corporate intruder. Possible inside job. The same prejudice he thought he'd escaped in the military now came roaring back, louder and crueler. Clara remained hospitalized, drifting between consciousness and confusion. But when she finally woke, she remembered everything. The men, the syringe, the threat. She demanded David's release, confirming his innocence. Yet even then, not everyone believed her. Some executives in her own company began questioning whether hiring someone like him had been a mistake. David returned to work, but things weren't the same. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Coworkers whispered behind his back. The same people who once ignored him now watched him with suspicion. Still, he didn't quit. He had a mission now, one that no uniform could give him. With Evelyn's help, David began to dig deeper. He used his old military contacts, people who owed him favors, people who trusted him. Piece by piece, they uncovered the rot underneath Kane Global Holdings. Offshore accounts, encrypted calls, corporate assassins, proof of a network built on coercion and fear. Every revelation made the danger more real. One night, while walking home, David noticed a black SUV trailing him. He didn't panic. He led them into a dead-end alley, vanished into the shadows, and when the car backed out, he was already gone. Old instincts never die. But the deeper he dug, the more powerful the enemy became. Kane wasn't just rich, he was protected. Judges, cops, lobbyists all had ties to his empire. Taking him down meant risking everything. Then came the call that changed everything. Clara, now recovering, offered him a new position, Director of Security and Corporate Ethics. She wanted him officially by her side, not just as protection but as a symbol of what Lexington truly stood for. He accepted quietly. Days later, Gregory Kane called Clara personally. His tone was cold, confident. "Tell your janitor to stay out of things he doesn't understand," he sneered. But David was listening. And what Kane didn't know was that the call was being recorded. As the line went dead, David turned to Clara. He just made his first mistake. Because for the first time, the fight wasn't in the shadows anymore. It was in the open. And the janitor the world ignored was about to bring a billionaire to his knees. But Kane wasn't done yet. He had one last card to play. And the next move would test everything David had ever stood for. The storm that had once raged outside the Lexington Tower now lived inside David Carter. It wasn't the weather, it was war. For weeks, he and Evelyn Ross had quietly built a case against Gregory Kane, collecting evidence from encrypted emails, offshore transfers, and the terrified confessions of employees who finally found the courage to speak. But every lead came with a shadow. Every truth came with a threat. The walls were closing in. Kane had power, money, lawyers, and influence stretching from city halls to courtrooms. When his first attempt to silence Clara failed, he shifted his focus. The headlines began to twist the story, reshaping it into something ugly. Ex-soldier turned janitor linked to CEO attack. Security consultant or inside spy? David's face filled the news cycle. The same people who had once ignored him now saw him as dangerous. The racism wasn't new, it was just louder now. Every comment, every whisper, reminded him of the invisible weight he carried. He wasn't judged by what he had done, but by who he was. Still, he stayed quiet, because he knew noise didn't win battles. Evidence did. Then came the night everything shattered. At 2 a.m., his phone buzzed with a call from Evelyn. Her voice trembled, something David had never heard before. "They're coming for Clara," she whispered. Before he could respond, the line went dead. David grabbed his coat and raced through the empty streets toward Clara's mansion on the north side. The rain pounded harder with every step, like the world itself was warning him. When he arrived, the front gates were open, lights flickering through shattered glass. Inside, chaos. Footprints, overturned furniture, the lingering stench of gasoline. He followed the faint sound of sobbing down the corridor. Lily. She was hiding under the staircase, clutching her teddy bear, her small hands shaking. "They took Mommy," she gasped. David felt the past collide with the present. The soldier inside him, the one he thought he'd buried, rose again. He stepped outside into the storm, scanning the street. Headlights appeared at the far end, a black van speeding away. He sprinted to his truck, tires screeching as he followed the trail through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago. Every instinct screamed danger, but he didn't care. He'd already lost too many people in war. He wasn't losing anyone else. The chase ended at an abandoned shipping yard near the river. The van's doors were open. He saw them. 2 men dragging Clara toward a warehouse entrance, her wrists bound, her face bruised. David moved silently, methodically. He wasn't the janitor anymore. He was Captain Carter again. Inside the warehouse, Kane waited. He stood beneath a single hanging light, his expensive suit glistening with raindrops, his smirk calm and cruel. "So this is the famous janitor," Kane sneered. "You should have stayed in your lane, son." David said nothing. His silence was its own weapon. Kane circled him slowly. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? A man with your past? You're kind? You're convenient until you're not. Then you disappear like all the rest." The words hit like bullets. But they didn't wound, they ignited. David's voice finally broke the silence. "I've been disappearing my whole life," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Kane nodded to his men. They moved in, but David was faster. The first went down with a sharp elbow, the second with a disarm that sent his weapon flying. He wasn't fighting for revenge, he was fighting for proof, for the truth that people like Kane buried under power and prejudice. Kane grabbed Clara and pulled a gun from his jacket. "You take one more step," he hissed, "and she dies." David froze. The air hung still, heavy with rain and fear. Then a voice crackled through the warehouse speakers. A calm, feminine voice. "Evelyn Ross." "Gregory Kane," she said. "You're live on national television." Kane's face twisted in disbelief. Cameras hidden in the rafters blinked red, broadcasting every second to news outlets across the country. David stepped forward slowly. "That call you made," he said. "The one where you threatened Clara? It went public, too." Kane's composure cracked. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the doors burst open. Dozens of FBI agents flooded in, shouting commands. Red laser dots crossed his chest. In the confusion, Kane turned toward David one last time, eyes burning with hate. "You think they'll ever see you as an equal?" he spat. "You're still just a janitor." David met his gaze, calm and steady. "Then I'll be the janitor who swept your empire clean." The agents closed in, handcuffing Kane as he shouted and fought. Outside, the storm began to break. The rain slowed, the sky lightened, and for the first time in years, David felt something he hadn't felt since the battlefield: peace. But as the agents led Kane away, the cameras still rolling, David noticed something deeper in the crowd gathering outside the warehouse. People watching, some cheering, others silent. And in their faces, he saw the divide he had lived his entire life. The disbelief that someone like him could be the hero. Because even when the truth was visible, some still chose not to see it. Later, as he stood under the dim glow of the streetlights, he realized the fight wasn't just against Gregory Kane. It was against a world that still measured worth by skin and status. And though the war was far from over, tonight, justice had a name. But the cost of exposing the truth was only beginning to unfold. Because when power falls, it never falls quietly. And somewhere in the darkness, the people who once stood beside Kane were already planning their next move. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. In the weeks that followed Gregory Kane's arrest, the headlines shifted from scandal to reckoning. CEO exposed in corporate racism and corruption probe. The news read. Cameras swarmed the Lexan Tower, the same place where David Carter had once been told to use the back door. The same halls that had whispered against him now echoed his name with respect and discomfort. But for David, it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. He returned to work quietly, just as he had always done. The mop bucket rolled along the marble floors, the sound steady, almost meditative. But this time, people looked at him differently. Not with pity, not with superiority, with a kind of awkward respect born not from empathy but from shock. They had seen his courage, yet many still couldn't understand it. And that was the hardest part, because racism doesn't end with one arrest, one apology, or one viral story. It hides in the silence after applause, the silence of people who are relieved it's over, even though for someone like David, it never really is. Clara recovered slowly. The bruises faded, but the scars, emotional and social, ran deeper. She stood before the board a month later, her voice steady but filled with fire, as she exposed every detail of Kane's crimes. Her courage cost her everything, the company, the wealth, the comfort, but she never flinched. For years, she said, I let silence protect privilege. That ends today. The boardroom fell quiet. For the first time in that tower's history, a white woman's confession and a black man's truth stood side by side. Not as enemies, not as savior and victim, but as equals in courage. Evelyn Ross, the investigator who risked her career to expose the truth, later told reporters, justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in the mirror. Her words went viral. But David didn't care about viral. He cared about Lily, the little girl who had once cried under the staircase. He visited her weeks later. She ran up to him, holding a crumpled thank you card. On it, written in her uneven handwriting, were the words, You saved my mom. You're my hero. David smiled, his heart heavy and full all at once. Because he knew what she didn't, that heroism was never about saving others. It was about refusing to be erased. When the trial ended, Kane was sentenced to 25 years. But the system, as always, tried to make it about individuals. One bad CEO, one shocking case. What they didn't see was the pattern, the 1,000 smaller injustices that never made it to court. The janitors who lost jobs for speaking up. The employees who were silenced for being too vocal. The unspoken walls that divided people long before anyone built fences. David became a quiet symbol, not a celebrity, not a public speaker, but a reminder. He started working with a local organization that trained young people of color for corporate positions. He told them the truth, the kind no one likes to say aloud. You'll have to work twice as hard, he said. You'll be judged before you're seen. But never let that steal your dignity. Never let them decide your worth. His story spread through word of mouth, shared not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. It wasn't about revenge or triumph. It was about endurance. About how one man refused to bow, even when the world demanded it. Months later, a journalist asked him what justice felt like. David paused for a long moment before answering. Justice, he said quietly. Justice is when no one's surprised that a janitor had courage. The interviewer didn't know what to say, but the silence said everything. Because in the end, this story was never just about one man or one company. It was about all of us, the systems we allow, the stereotypes we ignore, the voices we choose not to hear until they're screaming. Every person watching this right now has a choice. You can look away, say, "That's terrible," and move on. Or you can ask the harder question, why does it still happen? Why does the color of someone's skin still decide how much their truth is worth? David Carter's name may fade from the headlines. The hashtags may stop trending. But his story, the struggle behind it, belongs to every person who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or silenced. It's a reminder that dignity can't be given by power. It's born in resistance. And sometimes the quietest voices shake the tallest towers. So if you're watching this right now, don't just feel something. Do something. Speak up when it's uncomfortable. Listen when it's easier to stay silent. Challenge the jokes, the biases, the systems that thrive on ignorance. Because change doesn't begin with marches or protests. It begins with moments like this. Moments when you choose to see. And as David once said to a young volunteer who asked him if he'd ever forgive the people who doubted him, he simply smiled and replied, "I don't need to forgive them. I just need to outlive their hate." The screen fades to black, the music slows, and the final line appears. Racism doesn't end with a story. It ends when silence does. Now it's your turn to speak. If the story moved you, share it, comment, and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for awareness. Because stories like this aren't fiction. They're happening right now. And someone, somewhere, is still waiting to be heard. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. What would you have done if you were in David's place? Would you have spoken up? Or stayed silent like everyone else? Stories like his remind us that real courage often comes from the most unexpected people. If you believe more people should hear stories that expose truth, injustice, and hope, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Your support helps keep powerful stories like this alive.